A successful direct fire salvo gave us even more confidence in our weapon. We were confirmed in the opinion that we could use it even more boldly and decisively to make full use of its maneuverability and the power of fire. Autumn came. October rains came. The maneuverability of the Katyushas practically depended on the passability of roads. And the enemy, having numerical superiority in tanks, continued to push our troops. To strengthen the defence of the Valkovsky direction, 2 divisions of the 4th Regiment were transferred to the village Kolomak, which is 70 kilometers west of Kharkov. Here the defence was held by severely thinned rifle units and cavalry squadrons. On October 12th in the evening we received the task to support by fire the units, which by dawn should go to the defence line north of Kolomak. At night, under the pouring rain, the divisions occupied the combat order. Under the wheels of the rigs we laid kindling to prevent them from sinking into the soaked black earth. The division commanders took observation posts and established communication with the firing positions. Our regimental NP, where we arrived with Radchenko at dawn, was located near the NP of the 2nd Division, which was now commanded by Captain S. I. Semenov. By dawn the annoying rain had finally stopped. Along the ravines the fog was drifting. Distant farms and forests were not visible in the greying mist, but in front of our front line the terrain was quite well visible. From our observation post we could clearly see how the enemy infantry was being drawn into the nearest farm. With an experienced eye we could detect camouflaged Nazi tanks in the gardens. By all signs the enemy was preparing for an offensive and pulled up reserves. Our aviation did not act, the enemy was not subjected to shelling, and therefore openly continued to pull together forces. To the farm from afar, without camouflage, pulled up cars and tanks. Of course, the most correct thing would be to immediately hit the Hitlerites, but there were few shells and we could not spend them this time without permission. By phone I contacted the division commander and asked him to get permission to volley. However, we did not receive an answer for a long time, and in the meantime the Nazis began to turn around to attack, and any minute now we should have expected the beginning of artillery preparation. It was still possible to thwart the enemy's attack, but to all our inquiries we received one answer: wait for the command. It happened as we expected. The enemy opened heavy artillery and mortar fire on our observation posts and infantry trenches. Being in narrow, deep trenches, we suffered no great losses. However, our radio station was broken and telephone communication with firing positions and division headquarters was disrupted. The enemy moved the fire to the depth of our defences, and the communicators rushed to restore communication. But they did not have time to do it. Right in front of us, at a distance of 200 meters, German helmets appeared from behind high sunflowers. The Nazis rushed into the attack, firing from automatic rifles and machine guns. Rare chains of our infantry could not withstand the onslaught of the enemy and began to retreat. Hitlerites almost closely approached our observation posts. With grenades, fire of automatic rifles and 2 hand-held machine guns we managed to throw them back a few hundred meters. Migdat Kasanov, assistant commander of the reconnaissance platoon, was especially accurate in hitting the enemy. Another machine gun was beating from the observation point of the 2nd Division. The fascists were forced to retreat again to the sunflower field. However, in just a few minutes hurricane artillery and mortar fire was again opened on our observation posts. German machine gunners began to circle us from the right and left, and what is most unpleasant, on the right, tanks went around us. There was a real threat to the firing positions of our divisions. It was urgent to give the command to open fire or to take away the fighting vehicles. Excruciating frustration seized me, to have such a strong weapon and not use it, but how to warn the divisions. Ivan Nikiforovich, I turned to the commissar, please. Radchenko understood me half-heartedly. And here he is together with Brizgalov and Bodryashov running to the combat vehicles. Will they succeed? We could see how the group of commissar crossed the gully and began to climb the other slope of the ravine. And then the fascist machine gunners, who bypassed us on the right, opened a hurricane fire on the group. Radchenko fell. Behind him, Brizgalov and Bodryashov. Are they killed? You can clearly see how around the commissar and his comrades flying clods of earth from machine gun fire. Cover the commissar immediately. I ordered Kasanov. The fire of our machine guns silenced the Hitlerites. That's right, bastards. Hurrah. Radchenko and the guys jumped to their feet and ran on with all their might. Here they have already hidden in the bushes. Now they will have time. Looking back, I saw Lieutenant V.I. Fedorov. Fedorov, commander of the topographic reconnaissance platoon. He was lying immovable at the exit from the trench. I rushed to him. Fedorov. My dear, what's the matter with you? He looked at me silently. The lieutenant apparently had a state of shock. I ordered the scouts to carry him to the shelter, to the ravine. None of us, of course, could not have imagined then that Fedorov would become a talented architect, restorer of Moscow antiquities and palaces of the Grey Kremlin. Soon we were forced to leave the observation posts and withdraw towards the railroad, behind which were our firing positions. There we were almost simultaneously with Radchenko. My athletic training received at the Tomsk Artillery School had an impact. In the Siberian military district, I several years in a row took first place in the military sports all around, which included running for 5,000 meters. And in 1935 I set an all-army record at the 50-kilometer ski distance. So we are at the firing position. A volley was out of the question. The enemy tanks on the right flank approached the railroad. They were already 1.5 kilometers away from the combat vehicles. And the shortest distance at which you can open fire in these conditions 3 kilometers. Again we were let down by the design imperfection of the launchers. The German infantry had already entered the zone where our fire was powerless. Radchenko immediately gave the command engines, but as soon as the combat vehicles moved from the place, moving off the decks, they stalled, burrowing deeply into the ground with their wheels. The rain, a terrible fall rain that poured all night long, washed out the road. No efforts of the guardsmen could not move the vehicles. Tanks and machine gunners of the enemy were already near the railway embankment, from which to the firing position was no more than 800 meters. The regiment had no anti-tank means. There was no artillery battery nearby. I thought with despair that if in a few minutes it would not be possible to pull out the combat rigs, I would have to give the command to blow them up. And then the battery commander, Lieutenant Chugui, one of those artillerymen whom I had selected at Yartsevo in the 16th Army, ran up to me. Comrade Commander, over there in those bushes are our tanks. I rushed over there, and indeed just some 200 meters from our firing position stood camouflaged 30 Chekars. Here at the staff car stood, and their commander. Comrade tankers, help me out. Our firing positions are attacked by fascist tanks, and the cars are stalling. The commander of the tank unit ordered 3 crews to cover the firing position, and the other 2 to pull out the fighting vehicles on the road. In a few minutes the 30 quarter tanks rushed towards the enemy. With friendly fire they met the German vehicles that appeared from behind the railroad tracks and immediately set 2 of them on fire. Nazi tanks TIV could not resist our 30 Chetverkers and withdrew behind the railroad line. Left without cover, the enemy infantry rolled back. It is difficult to convey the joy that seized us then. How grateful we were to the resolute and courageous tankers. We warmly said goodbye to them, but unfortunately, as it often happened in the war, we did not ask their names or what unit they were from. This battle near the farm Novi Paris taught us a lot, made us think once again about the advantages and disadvantages of our weapons. Of course, it is impossible to look at many things now as before, and my assessments will be largely diluted by time and experience. Great difficulties in the use of reactive artillery were the peculiarities of its fire. The firing positions of the Katyushas could not be reliably concealed from enemy observation either behind buildings or behind hills or groves because of the smoke at the positions and the fiery trails of the flying shells. The flight of the missile in the active part of the trajectory is accompanied by a bright flame flying out of the nozzle in the form of a long torch. It is clearly visible at a great distance. This gave the enemy the opportunity to detect our positions and open artillery and mortar fire on them, and sometimes bombing. Therefore, the combat vehicles after a salvo had to immediately withdraw to waiting positions, where they were sheltered and charged. For the same reason, it was not recommended to fire from old firing positions. At first, when the density of our artillery and troops in general was small, the choice of firing positions for missile divisions was not very difficult. However, later, when the number of our troops and equipment on the main directions began to increase, it became more and more difficult to find places for rocket positions. Of course, the fighters were always happy to see the Katyushas, and especially when they made destructive salvos. But because of the smoke on our firing positions demasked units that were located near them. They suffered a lot from the Nazi artillery fire, and from the bombardment of the any aircraft hunting for the Katyushas. Subsequently, to avoid this, during the preparation for the offensive, the first to choose firing positions were the rocket launchers. Other troops were located away from the Guards' mortar units. Firing tasks for the Katyushas often arose unexpectedly, and as a rule there was no time to prepare positions, and even less time for topographic reference. In such cases it was necessary to tie in to local objects, bridges, road crossings, churches and other points on the map. All this affected the accuracy of firing, and only the high training of artillery commanders helped to exclude unfortunate blunders and ensure the defeat of targets. A lot of trouble was caused by the unusual ellipse of dispersion, which has already been discussed. When firing at close ranges, the scattering ellipse stretched out in a narrow strip more than a kilometre deep, and when firing at extreme ranges stretched along the front. At medium ranges it was closer to a circle in shape. Conventional classical artillery could hit targets at different ranges from the same position with equal effectiveness. We, missiles, first found the target, determined its size, shape and location relative to the front line. Then we chose the most favourable striking ellipse, and by the shape of the ellipse we chose the areas of firing positions, i.e., the most favourable firing range. Our observation posts were located as close to the front as possible. Because of the large dispersion of the Guards' mortars could not fire on targets located closer than 700 metres from our front line. In order not to hit our units, we had to know its exact location. Our fighting vehicles did not have protective armour, it would have reduced their manoeuvrability. And the rockets could fire on their own in case of a short circuit in the electrical wiring. The short circuit could be caused by a stray bullet or shrapnel. And yet, for all its shortcomings, it was a formidable weapon. Manoeuvrability and rapidity of Katyusha, the power of volley fire created their undying glory. Their appearance on the battlefield inspired our troops. The Russian army used rockets in the wars of the 19th century. Armed with combat rockets of General K. I. Konstantinov, rocket teams successfully operated during the Crimean War. The reason for the decline in interest in combat rockets in the past was the invention of rifled guns and smokeless powder, providing greater range and better accuracy of fire. But among the chorus of voices condemning rockets sounded the voice of the indefatigable inventor and convinced rocket man General Konstantinov. He argued that people do not immediately think about the essence of things, long act according to the beaten habit, not thinking about possible changes and improvements, and from this will not soon appreciate the power of missiles. These words proved prophetic. The Tsarist government and the Tsarist army recklessly squandered all the achievements of the Russian rocket school. The young Soviet state did not receive from Tsarist Russia neither research institutions dealing with missiles, nor the missile industry. Therefore, all the major problems of creating rocket weapons had to be solved anew. Already on March 3, 1928, the world's first smokeless powder rocket projectile flew out of a mortar tube at a firing range near Leningrad. Excellent, for that time range of flight 1,300 meters testified that the work begun in 1920 by the Gas Dynamic Laboratory, crowned with certain success. Somewhat later in Moscow, at the Central Council of Osoviakhim, was created group for the study of jet propulsion. The efforts of the Leningrad laboratory were directed to the development of gunpowder jet engines, while the Moscow group dealt with liquid jet engines. In 1933, in order to unify and expand work on jet technology, these groups were merged into the Jet Research Institute. By the early 30s, quite precisely defined the areas in which the most appropriate was the use of jet engines. This is primarily aviation. After all, for firing jet shells do not need guns with heavy barrels and anti-bounce devices. Launching such projectiles instead of aerial bombs, it would be possible to get the effect of armor-piercing and concrete-piercing bombs. In addition, it would be possible to hit targets without being directly above them, which is also important for aviation. And finally, launch boosters in the form of jet engines could significantly reduce the run-up of airplanes. One of these tasks was solved successfully. Two rather perfect models of rockets were developed: fragmentation RS-82 and fragmentation fugitive RS-132. Both of them were intended for aviation and were very different from the shells used during the Great Patriotic War in field rocket artillery. They were shorter than ground shells, equipped with distance tubes, and had grooves on the warhead like a hand grenade to improve fragmentation. The projectile created in 1928 was an active jet projectile. It was fired from a mortar, which gave the projectile a certain initial velocity and set the desired direction of flight. The jet engine of the projectile itself developed its thrust in flight. Such projectiles were not suitable for aviation. The RS-82 and RS-132 projectiles were purely reactive. The first two types of Katyusha shells were created on the basis of the 82mm fragmentation and 132mm fragmentation fugitive shells adopted for aviation. The development of eras was far from smooth. The inspirer and initiator of this work was a talented designer, Boris Petropavlovsky. He was the first to calculate, manufacture and test purely reactive projectiles using smokeless pyroxylin trotyline powder. And immediately the designer faced the main problem for all jet projectiles, the problem of firing accuracy, which depends on the stability of flight. What was not done to ensure good accuracy? They tried, for example, to give rotation to a rocket projectile as to a gun projectile. To do this, part of the powder gases were vented through the side holes in the body. The result was a kind of turbojet. But more or less satisfactory results were achieved with the consumption of 1/3 of the powder charge only for rotation. However, this resulted in a loss of range. During these studies there were also very curious situations. Thus, eyewitnesses recall how the proposal of G.E. Langemak to fire a rocket projectile from an ordinary gun was tested. For this purpose, the body of the projectile was previously made rifling, as in gun shells. The test revealed the insidious nature of the rocket projectile, put in unusual conditions for him. After the shot, it did not fly out of the barrel, but jammed at the very muzzle and began to turn the gun in the direction of those who observed the shooting. They had to flee. There were attempts to stabilize the flight by pre-spinning with an electric motor. However, even this method did not give good accuracy. Failures were inherent in the very idea to stabilize the flight with the help of plumage, not exceeding the dimensions of the projectile. A certain inertness, adherence to the schemes of barrel artillery, was reflected in it. Designers did not think of a rocket gun that would not resemble a tube. Developers did not think of anything. Stabilizers of various shapes were proposed: T-shaped, circular, far behind the nozzle. They even tested stabilizers made of thin steel blades, opening in flight. They were previously rolled up in a roll. But all was in vain. Such varieties of rockets prowled all over the range. The solution to the problem was offered by V.A. Artemiev. His rockets with stabilizers, significantly beyond the caliber of the projectile, flew steadily. Now it was a matter of an acceptable launcher. So, the first and the main part of the future Katyusha, the rocket projectile, was ready. For the first time, RS-82 shells were tested in air battles with the Japanese in the Khalkhin-Gol area. I-15 fighters were armed with them. 132mm rockets were installed on SB bomber planes. In 1939, these shells were used to hit air and ground targets of the White Finns. Beginning its research work, RNII found support from Sergo Ordzonikidze, M. Tukhachevsky, who was then Chief of Armament of the Red Army. Already then, in the 1920s, these works showed that rocket weapons have a great future. In 1938, it was decided to create a multi-charged launcher for multiple rocket fire with 132mm caliber rockets. Work on the realization of this project began without delay. The decision was made in June, and in October of the same year 2 such launchers were mounted on ZS-5 vehicles. However, the first launchers did not pass the tests. They were rejected because of major design flaws, but the idea of firing rockets was fully approved, and the work continued. The development of rocket artillery was given great attention by the Central Committee of the party, our government, the leadership of the armed forces. This is understandable. After all, the emerging weapon concealed great possibilities. In fact, the experience of the First World War showed that the artillery of modern combat imposes new increased requirements for its maneuverability, massing fire and increasing its density. These tasks in the future could be successfully solved by reactive artillery. The jet engine in the projectile practically eliminated the effect of recoil forces on the gun during firing. This achieved a lot. It was possible to simplify the design of the carriage. It was possible to refuse expensive, high-quality steels used for the manufacture of gun barrels. At mass production of armament, such economy for the country was of great importance. The relatively light weight and simplicity of the jet guns opened up wide possibilities for their installation on airplanes, on car chassis, on tractors and tanks. This meant that there was a real opportunity to make these guns self-propelled, with increased cross-country ability. And, finally, the main advantage of reactive artillery, the ability to create a volley of massive fire. On June 7, 1939, at the Moscow region firing range tested firing launchers of a new design. They were mounted on the chassis of the Z6 automobile and had 16 rails. On them were placed in 2 rows of 132mm rockets. These samples of launchers were approved. In addition, a decision was made to develop fragmentation projectiles. The 132mm projectile was converted into a fragmentation projectile called the M13. The new model, in comparison with the 132mm aviation shell, underwent very significant design changes. Thus, the weight of its explosive increased from 1.9 to 4.9 kilograms, range up to 8,470 meters. On December 25, 1939, the 132mm fragmentation fugitive rocket projectile and its launcher were approved by the main artillery directorate. The task was given to produce a batch of launchers and projectiles. 11 such installations were made by the beginning of 1941. In June 1941, a review of armament took place. The review was attended by the People's Commissar of Defense Marshal of the Soviet Union S. K. Timoshenko, People's Commissar of Armament DFF, Ustinov, People's Commissar of Munitions B. L. Vanikov, Chief of the General Staff G.K. Zhukov, Chief of the Main Artillery Directorate ND, Yakovlev and others. Among the samples of new weapons were 4 installations BM-13. From each of them at the show fired 1 volley. BM-13 received high praise. June 21, 1941, it was decided to deploy serial production of M13 rockets and combat units to them. Serial production of BM-13 combat vehicles was organized at the Moscow plant compressor. M13 projectiles were made in Moscow and other cities. All the problems of organization of production, staffing had to solve in the difficult time of the first months of the war. At the same time, work was underway to create installations for firing 82mm caliber shells. The stock of these aviation fragmentation shells had been created in the country before the beginning of the war. In addition, the technology of their production had been developed, and it was possible to establish serial production quickly enough. In August 1941, a group of designers created a 36-round BM-8 on the chassis of the Z6 vehicle, and in September BM-8 with 24 rails on the chassis of the T-40 light tank. They were immediately put into production. Then the M8 projectile launchers with 24 guides were mounted on the chassis of the T-60 tank. On June 28, 194.1, the formation of the first battery of field rocket artillery began. It was created in 4 days in the first Moscow Red Banner Artillery School named after L.B. Krasin. It was now the world-famous battery of Captain I.A. Flerov, which fired the first salvo at the concentration of fascist troops at the station Orsha. Looking back to the first salvos of Katyusha, one can't help but marvel at the giant leap in the development of rocket technology, marvel at the genius of the Soviet people workers, designers, scientists. It was their talent, knowledge, will and energy that created the mighty shield of our motherland missile forces. But it took decades. In the meantime, there was an alarming fall of the 41st year, and our troops fought hard defensive battles. On October 17, 1941, by the decision of the Supreme Command Headquarters, the troops of the Southwestern Front began their withdrawal. At that time, the enemy was on the outskirts of Moscow, was tearing towards the Caucasus. Our stretched front could hardly hold back the onslaught of Hitler's hordes. Organized withdrawal allowed to improve the operational strategic position of the troops. The Southwestern Front restored elbow communication with the neighboring fronts, and most importantly, was able to withdraw a large number of forces to the reserve to help the troops fighting near Moscow. On October 18th, we were retreating through Kharkov. We had shells left for exactly one single volley. It was an inviolable reserve, which we could use only at the most critical moment for self-defense. We were given the task to save the secret technique and get shells at all costs. There are no words to express the pain and bitterness that we experienced leaving Kharkiv to the enemy. Institutions were hastily evacuated from the city, equipment of plants and factories was taken away. Cars, wagons, refugees with carts, knots, baby carriages were moving to the east in a continuous stream. We could not look into the eyes of those who stayed in the city and those who left Kharkiv. In their sorrowful looks we read bitter reproaches. Why do you, fighters and commanders, young, strong, why do you retreat together with us, old men, women, children? What could we answer them? Only the fact that this retreat was quite different from the retreat of the first days of the war was a little comforting. Now the fascists were no longer able to surround our troops, to take them in pincers. The war taught us something. The skill of the command staff has grown considerably. Our regiment was to concentrate in Malinovka, which is 3 kilometers south of Chugev. The 2nd Division continued to operate on the site of the 212th Infantry Division, and he was sent all the remaining shells. In Kharkov, Radchenko visited the City Party Committee. He decided to organize the issue of a multi-circulation newspaper. In the City Committee responded to his request willingly, and the Commissar received portable printing equipment, a supply of fonts and paper. He also visited the City Komsomol Committee, where he was recommended to take 4 female Komsomol members into the regiment. They were activists, and the City Committee was worried about their fate. The girls were given excellent recommendations. If they are not suitable for the sanitary part of the regiment, said the City Committee, they should be attached to some medical unit. We received an order from the head of the task force to withdraw to Starobelsk, and just before the march Radchenko arrived with a set of printing equipment, and 4 girls, Galia Garkusha, Galia Savchenko, Elvira Plezum and Sima Kutsenko. The time was difficult, and both acquisitions of the commissioner, frankly speaking, I was not very satisfied. I told Radchenko about it. The commissioner replied, "We'll live, we'll see. I think that over time your opinion will change. The girls are fighting, and for the printing press I have people. There are specialist typesetters and an experienced editor. A multi-circulation newspaper for divisions operating separately is simply necessary." "All right," I agreed, "we'll live and see. However, do not forget that you have not only a sanitary unit and printing house." "I always remember that," Radchenko parried. Our regiment was advancing on completely soggy roads. In some places vehicles and combat units without the help of people simply could not move. We marched in divisional columns day and night. On difficult sections several vehicles were hitched together by cables. All the guardsmen of the column, except for chauffeurs, gathered at the first vehicle, pulled it with ropes, pushed it forward. The head car of this train, with the help of the men, squeezed the track in the thick mud and dragged the others behind it. Strange as it may seem, this method turned out to be the most effective. It helped to overcome seemingly impassable areas. After Chugev, a man in a leather jacket approached us and asked us to take 8 city buses filled to the brim with boxes and leather bags. They contained money and jewelry from the Kharkov branch of the State Bank. Almost all of the vehicles turned out to be defective. For some reason there were no chauffeurs in the column. We had to allocate guardsmen who could drive a car and hitch the buses to the combat units. Needless to say, this made our movement even more difficult. As soon as there was a gap in the clouds, fascist planes appeared in the air. They bombed and machine-gunned our retreating troops and refugees. At crossings, On difficult sections of the road, where traffic jams formed, the regiment's columns were covered by an anti-aircraft division. It consisted of 3 batteries of 37mm anti-aircraft guns and a battery of counter-machine guns on vehicles. The commander of the division, Captain M.A.E. Syniagovsky, skillfully chose firing positions for his batteries, which he somehow miraculously managed to move from line to line. People were exhausted from fatigue, fell off their feet. That's the march, the guardsmen joked sullenly, the 7th day, the 8th kilometre. And then there are raids of enemy aviation. We opened group fire from rifles and automatic rifles on diving and flying on a shaving flight of enemy planes. Once our anti-aircraft division shot down an enemy airplane. The Nazi pilot, who landed by parachute not far from the column, we took prisoner. From the continuous hard work of the engines overheated, fuel consumption was high. Luckily for us, at Bolatslovka station, there was a 50-ton tank with gasoline. We refueled all the vehicles and filled the reserve tanks. This allowed us to get to Starobelsk. A few days later in Starobelsk came out the first issue of the regimental newspaper Gvardeyets. Our missileers read it with no less interest than any central newspaper. Later in Gvardeyets was printed a song about our Katyusha, written by an amateur poet of the Guards, Private E. K. Talalalevsky. Here is its text. Katyusha. Cheerfully and amicably, the Guardsman. Let's sing a song with hundreds of voices. About our glorious Katyusha. About the immortal valour of the soldiers. The fearsome Katyusha is going into battle to strike the horde of beasts with merciless marksmanship. The volleys of our brave batteries. The fierce Krauts from Berlin can't leave the battlefield alive if our fearsome machine rattles with steel and fire. So let's play it cheerfully and merrily. With our chests spread out like guardsmen, our song about our dear Katyusha, which is making its way to the west. From November 2nd to 18, 1941, our regiment was repairing combat and transport vehicles in Starobelsk, accumulating ammunition, which was delivered by special echelons from Moscow. Here we repaired a part of buses with valuables of Kharkov branch of the State Bank. When it got a little frosty and the roads got stronger, we sent the money column to Voroshilovgrad, where we handed over all the valuables to the State Bank. For this, the regiment later received a commendation from the Supreme Commander-in-Chief Stalin and 12 combat vehicles with nameplates on the cabs. These vehicles arrived to the regiment at Stalingrad. They were awarded to the most courageous calculations. In Starobelsk, free from repairs guardsmen were intensively engaged in combat training. Communists and Komsomol members in the regiment was about 60%. This allowed to create in divisions primary and in batteries and service units grassroots party and Komsomol organizations. The commissars of divisions and batteries had an opportunity to study the personnel more thoroughly, to determine the forms and methods of party political work. In the units held meetings of party and Komsomol bureaus, conversations, political informations, issued combat leaflets. The regimental newspaper Guardian was a great success among all the personnel of the regiment. Junior political officer Tumanov turned out to be an experienced and enterprising editor, and Guardsman Shabak was an excellent typesetter. The newspaper covered the combat life of the regiment units, party political work, told about those who distinguished themselves in battles. Creatively and proactively began to work party committee, created on September 19th near Kharkov. Its secretary was I, Shestiko, and members were V. P. Korovnikov and A. K. Mordovsky. From the first days the commission chose the right method of work, and admission to the party and Komsomol. Consideration of any cases were held directly in the units in their combat orders. This party commission provided invaluable assistance to the command in raising discipline and combat effectiveness. In honor of the 24th anniversary of the Great October Socialist Revolution, the Commissar and I decided to hold a general meeting of the regiment's personnel, as well as a meeting of the command staff. We managed to get the City Club for a while, but since the whole regiment had no place there, the meeting was attended by representatives from each division and service of the regiment. Before the meeting began, we all stood in mournful silence and honoured the memory of those who died in the first battles: Lieutenant Spirin Nikolai Nikolaevich, Staff Sergeant Agafonov Sergei Ivanovich, Private Roman Mikhailovich Baikov, Sergeant Viktor Ivanovich Chuvalov, Scout Nikolai Kobzarov, Lieutenant Vasily Romanov, Private Ivan Kavashnev, Gun Commander Fyodor Strelov, Private Ivan Stepanenko, Gunner Ivan Morozov. At the meeting, we summarized the results of the battles, analyzed the mistakes, noted the distinguished lieutenants I.F. Markov, I.F. Sokolenko, V.S. Arkhipov, N.I. Korov, Captain R.R. Vasilevich, Junior Political Officer A.L. Zhabko, Deputy Political Officer Radev, and many others. Attendees will read the order of General Kryuchenkin, in which all soldiers of the regiment declared gratitude. After the meeting, there was a concert. After all, artistic amateur divisions Radchenko began to prepare even in the period of formation. Especially great success was the performance of Gali Garkusha, our new son instructor, and auto technician I.K. Shevchuk. Ukrainian songs in their performance sounded so marvelous that even professional artists could envy them. Well, how was it, Commander? We'll wait and see. With irony reminded me Radchenko about our conversation in Malinovka. A few days later, in the same club, held the first meeting of the command staff of the regiment. It was attended by the head of the task force, A.D. Zubanov. D. Zubanov, Chief of Staff of the Group V. Vozniuk, members of the Military Council, F.N. Zhukov and Alaska Kizelev. The results were summarized and tasks were set. That evening, the officers of the regiment became better acquainted with each other. November cold weather came. The fascist command sought by all means before the onset of winter to seize the towns of Donbass, Lisichansk, Verkhny, Perezhnoye, Borovskoye, which were located on the high western bank of the Seversky Donets. This would allow the enemy to occupy the dominant heights, and most importantly, to place their troops in large population centers. Lisichansk, Verkhny, Perezhnoye and Borovskoye were defended by the cavalry corps of General A.F. Boykovsky, consisting of the 26th, 49th Cavalry and 320th Rifle Divisions. Hitlerites were pulling up fresh forces and were preparing an attack on Lisichansk. The command of the Southwestern Front decided to reinforce Boykovsky's corps with the task force of Colonel Zubanov's GMCH of the front, consisting of our 4th Regiment armed with BM-13 fighting machines and the 7th Guards Mortar Regiment armed with BM-8 machines. On November 18th, an order was received from Marshal of the Soviet Union S.K. Timoshenko to move Zubanov's group to the area of Borovskoye, Verkhny, to support Boykovsky's corps. The group headquarters and the 7th Guards Mortar Regiment went to Borovskoye. According to the combat order of the corps commander, the 4th Guards Mortar Regiment was to support the 49th Cavalry Division in Lisichansk. The 1st and 3rd Divisions of our regiment went to Lisichansk. The 2nd Division, headed by the commander Captain S.I. Semenov, left for Lisichansk. Semenov left by rail to reinforce the 1st Guards Division of General I.N. Rosyanov in the area of the city of Yellets. We and Commissar Radchenko followed at the head of the column of the 1st and 3rd Divisions of the regiment. At night, in 4 or 5 kilometers from Lisichansk, we were met by a colonel from the corps headquarters in a passenger car. I have an urgent instruction from the corps commander, he informed us, to meet your regiment and set the task to immediately open fire on the enemy, who prepared for an attack on Lisichansk. Here, in the light of headlights, he showed us the area of concentration of Hitlerites and the location of our advanced units. Comrade Colonel, I answered him, we can't shoot without making sure personally where our troops are, all the more so that we need to strike in front of the very front edge of our defences. Comrade Major. The colonel's voice rang with metal. If we do not cover the enemy now, at dawn he will seize the northern outskirts of Lisichansk. Try to knock him out of the stone buildings. We'll have to fire on the city. In general, you're not responsible for the consequences. I'm transmitting the corps commander's order and demand to immediately deploy the regiment and fire a salvo. Give me your map. He took the map, carefully circled with a pencil the area where we were to salvo, and here, on the map, signed We ourselves wanted to hit the enemy as soon as possible. So I was relieved and said, Well, let's figure out from where we can give a volley." "That's a different conversation," smiled the colonel. "On my map I estimated with a ruler that we could reach the specified area of enemy concentration only from Lisichansk itself, more precisely from the town square. And for that we had to cross to the western bank of the Seversky Donets." I reported my thoughts to the colonel. "Shoot from anywhere," he replied, "but let's fire faster." The regiment moved at high speed to Lisichansk. Without slowing down, we crossed the bridge, went up the mountain, and entered the town square. The cars of the control platoons stretched along the streets going to the northwestern outskirts. The city was still asleep. I ordered the division commanders to drive to the railroad and establish communication with our forward units. At the same time, communication was established between firing positions and observation posts. Combat vehicles entered the square one after another and deployed at shortened intervals, as in a parade. Following them, trucks with shells entered the square. While the installations were pointed along the given azimuth and loaded, the Assistant Chief of Staff, Senior Lieutenant Solomon, and I prepared the initial data for firing right on the sidewalk by the light of a flashlight. After mutual verification, they were transferred to the batteries, and in another 5 or 6 minutes the divisions were ready to fire. Having received reports on readiness, I gave the traditional command: "On the enemies of our motherland. Fire." The colonel from the Corps headquarters stood next to me during the salvo. "When the last shell flew out and everything was plunged into darkness," he said admiringly. "Wow, what a volley." Guardsmen were ordered to load the fighting vehicles again and wait for the command. Together with the colonel, Commissar Radchenko, and Senior Lieutenant Solomon, I drove to the northwestern outskirts of the city to the railroad crossing. When we arrived at the railroad embankment, it had already dawned. Smoke was spreading along the ravines, and fires were visible. Everywhere, wherever you look, black silhouettes were rushing. It was Hitlerites fleeing. It was a joy to look at such a picture, and at the same time it was a shame that the effect of a sudden fire attack our troops did not use. I asked the colonel why we do not pursue the fleeing Nazis. He waved his hand and said that no one expected such a result. Then he thanked us warmly and hurriedly left for the command post of the 49th Cavalry Division. Already leaving, he opened the car door and shouted, "Let's correct the mistake." Our advanced squadrons really after a while went on the offensive, but it was already too late. Hitlerites, not having received a repeated blow in pursuit and not seeing persecution from our side, after some time began to come to their senses. Separate fascist units, which were retreating by ravines through the village of Bogdanovtsa, located 5 kilometers from the front line, took refuge in strong stone buildings of the local state farm. To the right and left of Bogdanovka, the Germans also clung to settlements. The group of the enemy, settled in the buildings of the state farm, formed a kind of outpost covering the main forces. Of course, if we had given at least a few more battery volleys to the retreating Hitlerites, the subsequent fighting on this section of the front, perhaps, would have unfolded differently. But we had no right to spend shells more than it was specified by the command of the task force. Fighting for Bogdanovka took a protracted and heavy character. Cavalry corps of General Bytkovsky had to restrain as many enemy forces as possible, not counting on artillery and tank support. The main means of reinforcement of the corps were 2 Guards mortar regiments with a limited amount of ammunition. In the battles near Lisichansk revealed many positive qualities of our weapons and, alas, its shortcomings. We were once again convinced of the great maneuverability and strength of the new weapon, its ability to strike the enemy with sudden, crushing, massive blows. At the same time, when we had to knock the enemy out of the sturdy buildings of Bogdanovka and suppress well-concealed fire points, because of the large dispersion of shells of our batteries, we could not effectively solve these tasks. Here we also discovered another serious disadvantage of M13 shells. When firing at stone buildings, the fuses were set for high explosive action. And that's when it turned out that not all the shells burst. We immediately reported this to Moscow. With the accumulations of enemy troops in the open terrain, we coped quite easily. But faced with the enemy well entrenched and entrenched in strong stone buildings, we could not provide effective solution of firing tasks. Meanwhile, the elimination of the Bogdanov protrusion and advance were unthinkable without active fire support. Without such support, the cavalry regiments of the Corps and regiments of the 320th Infantry Division suffered heavy losses. During the battles near Lisichansk, our sanitary unit rendered invaluable assistance to the forward battalions and squadrons in evacuating the wounded from the battlefield, in rendering them medical aid. Here showed themselves with the best side of the Komsomol girls who joined us in Kharkov. Not far from our observation point in the lowland there were several barns. In them Kolmanskik had equipped an advanced medical station. From empty iron barrels stoves were made, and there was everything necessary for first aid to the wounded, delivered from the battlefield by our fragile-looking girls. Watching the work of orderlies, we marvelled at their courage, strength and energy. They withstood colossal loads on a par with men. Our lovely singer Galia Garkusha, now Galina Ilinikna Dergacheva, director of the Kharkov TV studio, recalls these battles. The day of November 22nd, 1941 was remembered for the rest of my life. On this day I turned 20 years old, and it also became the day of my baptism of fire. This day was mixed with night. There were so many wounded infantrymen and cavalrymen that I no longer cried while dressing wounds. My hands, numb with fatigue and cold, seemed to work automatically, but it was terrible to close my eyes in a moment of respite. Immediately the same terrible picture appeared, a living, shining red veil, nothing else. Just everything red. Blood. Blood. But there was another feeling. This feeling of wild joy, delight, pride, strength, which was caused by the first time I saw and heard the Katyusha salvo. What a time it was. We were retreating. But the rumor about the miracle girl Katyusha whirled around the fronts. Few people knew what she looked like and what kind of songs she sang. However, as soon as someone said that there was a Katyusha on this section of the front, where only the forces came from. When I once expressed my admiration to our doctor for the courage and training of the girls' sanitarians, Kolmanskik, as always, emphasizing the O, answered me. Comrade Commander, we did not waste time in Starobelsk. From morning till evening we were practicing with them and with all the medics. They had time to go through the whole course of first aid. We trained them to bandage and carry the wounded from the battlefield. And courage. They have special courage. If you could hear how at night they were not just crying but weeping. I used to say to them, well, girls, cry, it'll be easier on your soul. But then, especially in battle, no one should see your tears. On November 22nd, 1941, in our location, we detained 2 enemy spies. They were taken to Lisichansk. One of them categorically refused to understand Russian and mumbled that he was a Romanian who had fled from the Germans. At the Frunze Academy, I studied the Romanian language and began to ask the saboteur questions in Romanian. From his first words, it became clear that he was as Romanian as I was a Negro. Seeing his failure and hoping to save his life, the saboteur confessed that he was a former Tambov kulak and had been thrown by the Germans with the task of signaling to enemy planes about the locations of our combat installations, to try to blow up the ammunition depot, to get technical documentation, and if he could, to steal a rocket shell. He also reported that after the first Katyusha salvo, the fascists tried to establish the locations of our waiting positions or ammunition depot, and now they are trying to get information about new weapons at any cost. For this purpose, they threw 4 saboteurs to our rear. The other 2 were soon caught and punished. Our weapons were terrible for the enemy. The strength of its impact can be judged by the alarming signals that the Nazi command sent to its troops. Thus, the order of the German command from August 14th, 1941 said the Russians have an automatic multi-barrel flamethrower gun. The shot is fired by electricity. During the firing, smoke is produced. If such guns are captured, report immediately. And soon there was a new directive, entitled Russian Gun, throwing rocket-like projectiles. It said that the troops report the use of the Russians a new type of weapon firing rocket projectiles. From one installation within 3 to 5 seconds can be made a large number of shots. Every appearance of these guns should be reported to the general commanding the chemical troops under the Supreme Command on the same day. During the fighting at Lisichansk, from November 19th to December 2nd, our regiment fired 116 battery salvos. A total of 6,392 shells were fired. We took all measures to help the units of the 49th Cavalry and 320th Infantry Divisions to capture Bogdanovka, Zolotoryevka, Mali Ryazantsev and Mes. But without the support of large-caliber artillery, tanks and aviation, we failed to destroy the enemy's strongholds. And what only we did not think up to help the 49th and 320th Divisions. We conducted night fire raids. We brought 37mm anti-aircraft batteries to open positions. They suddenly appeared from the side of the forest, on the edge of the forest, and opened a rapid fire on the enemy's firing points. At the same time, from closed positions, we gave a battery salvo on the location of enemy mortar batteries in the area of Bogdanovka. The goal was the same: to destroy as much enemy's living force as possible. During these battles, we thoroughly studied the location of enemy fire points, his habits, and came to the conclusion that to eliminate the Bogdanovka overhang with available forces and means can only be a sudden night rapid attack, and not head-on, but from the flank. Our plan was as follows. From artillerymen and volunteer cavalrymen, it was supposed to create 4 strike groups armed with automatic rifles, grenades and hand machine guns. Under cover of darkness, they were to move to the initial positions for the offensive. Behind them, the telephone communication was laid. At the same time, on the edge of the forest, where the anti-aircraft guns were withdrawn, a battery of combat vehicles was to go out for direct fire on the southern outskirts of the village of Bogdanovka. With this battery also established a telephone link. Other batteries of the division were supposed to target the center of Bogdanovka and its northern outskirts, where the enemy infantry was located. Flare signals for call and cease fire and other signaling were installed. The offensive was to begin at 3 o'clock in the morning. As soon as the strike groups had taken the initial position and the machine guns on vehicles were brought to their flanks, the battery put on direct fire, will open a methodical fire, will begin to release 1 shell at regular intervals. This would be followed by volleys of other batteries on the center of Bogdanovka and methodical flank fire on its northern outskirts. Thus it was supposed to create a kind of fire fringe of the strike groups. Under the cover of Katyusha fire and counter-machine guns, the strike groups would go on the attack, 1 in front, 2 a ledge behind on the flanks. The 4th group was the reserve of the commander of the assault squad. I must say that there were more than enough volunteers to take part in this night attack. The cursed Bogdanov's ledge, as they call it, sat in our livers. On the night of December 2nd, my commissar and I reported our plan for the capture of Bogdanovka to A.D. Zubanov and the corps. After some clarifications, our plan was accepted. We were heartily wished success. We immediately went to the area of our NP to organize and conduct the offensive. It remained only to act. And suddenly we received an order by telephone to postpone the offensive. The commander and the commissar of the regiment to urgently arrive at the headquarters of the task force to give the divisions an offensive and to concentrate them in Lisichansk. At the headquarters of the group, we were informed that on the basis of the combat order of the Southwestern Front Command, Zubanov's group should urgently load into echelons for transfer to Kostornaya station with the task to support the 5th Cavalry Corps of General V.D. Kryuchenkin, which was a part of General F.Y. Kostenko's group. In early December 1941, the Nazi command, to ensure the advance of Guderian's tanks to Moscow from the south, undertook an offensive in the direction of Yellets. The enemy captured Yellets and continued to advance on Zadonsk. Guided by the general plan of military operations of the fronts, the Commander-in-Chief of the Southwestern Direction and Commander of the Southwestern Front Marshal of the Soviet Union S.K. Timoshenko sought to organize a counter-offensive of the Southwestern Front in the flank and rear of the Yellets group of Hitlerites. For this purpose was created a group of General F.Y. Kostenko. It included the 5th Cavalry Corps, commanded by General V.D. Kryuchenkin, the 1st Guards Rifle Division of General in Rusyanov, 34th Motorized Rifle and 129th Tank Brigades, to reinforce these troops and transferred from the area of Lisichansk to Kostornaya Operational Group of Guards Mortar Units of Colonel A.D. Zubanov. December 2nd, our regiment was loaded into the railroad echelons and in the evening of December 4th arrived in Kostornaya. Here we were placed at the disposal of the commander of the 5th Cavalry Corps. We saw old battle friends again. General Kryuchenkin, now the commander of the corps, met us like relatives. Guardsmen, my dears. He excitedly paced the room. Big things are coming. The defeat of the Yellets grouping of the fascists was planned to be carried out by the forces of the mobile group of General Kostenko in cooperation with the troops of the 13th Army. On December 5th, the 13th Army went on the offensive, and the mobile group of General Kostenko, in the night of December 7th, took the initial positions. Under the cover of night battle, reconnaissance was successful, and parts of the 5th Cavalry Corps and the 1st Guards Rifle Division went on the offensive. They were to go to the rear of the Yellets grouping of the enemy. From December 8th to December 13th Cavalry Corps units passed 120 kilometers through the rear of the fascist troops. In this raid, the 1st Division of our regiment supported the 14th Cavalry Division and the 3rd Division the 32nd. The 2nd Division operated with the 1st Guards Rifle Division of General Rusyanov. The 3rd Cavalry Division was supported by the 7th Guards Mortar Regiment. Zubanov's task force of the Guards mortar units was attached to General Kryachenkin's headquarters. On December 13th, the 14th and 32nd Cavalry Divisions went to the rear of the main group of the enemy and had to ride the railroad line and dirt road, which went from Yellets through Rososhnoy, Verkhnaya Lubovskaya, and further into the enemy's deep rear. The divisions had the task of preventing the main grouping of the enemy to withdraw to the west. The night of December 14th for our regiment, and especially for its 1st Division, was the most difficult. On December 13th, the commanders of the 14th and 32nd Cavalry Divisions, in execution of the order of the Corps commander, determined the main task of their troops to cut the railroad and seize the large settlements of Orevo and Orevo-Petrovskoye. At the same time, they did not give due importance to the dirt highway that went from Rososhny to Verkhnaya Lyubovsa. This road was not blocked. By the evening of December 13th, regiments of the 32nd Division came to the line of the railroad northwest of Rososhnoy and were aimed at Orevo. By 6 p.m., they approached its southern outskirts. Regiments of the 14th Division occupied Vorontsovka and Yelagino. At this time, the enemy units under the pressure of Rusyanov's division began to retreat towards Rososhny and Krasnaya Zarya. From Rososhnoy, Hitlerites in columns moved westward along the railroad line and along the dirt road going to Verkhnaya Lyubovsha. The regiments of the 32nd Cavalry Division and the division of our regiment, operating near Orvo, were cut off from the Corps headquarters and their rear. Because of steep ravines and ice, vehicles of the 1st Division, motor pool, sanitary unit and headquarters of our regiment could not follow the route of the 14th Cavalry Division. And then it was decided that on the night of December 14th, the 1st Division would take up battle order on the highway 5 kilometers southeast of Verkhnaya Lyubovsha. Loaded combat units were placed in a gully and deployed along the road towards Rososhny. The transport vehicles of the artillery park, regimental headquarters and sanitary unit were positioned not far from the firing position. On the road in the direction of Rososhnoy was sent a reinforced combat guard headed by the head of the regiment's chemical service, Senior Lieutenant N. I. Korolev, a brave and energetic officer. The situation was unclear. At 11 o'clock in the evening I checked the combat guard and moved it much farther forward along the road, which was to be covered by the 32nd Cavalry Division. After one very bitter lesson, I always paid maximum attention at the front to reconnaissance and combat guard, checked their actions as soon as the opportunity presented itself. It was on the night of June 26, 1941, near the station Govya, which is in western Belorussia. The 2nd Division of the 170th Artillery Regiment, which I commanded at that time, followed the highway through the Govya station at about 1 a.m. All mounted men were in a hurry. Scouts and artillery harness riders led the horses. The division came to a fork in the road. The highway went to the right, and the forest road turned to the left. Our column was to follow the highway. But then tanks with extinguished headlights came from the forest to the fork. About 80 meters from our column they stopped. The division commander, Captain Shikelchik, and the officers who followed in the head of the column were sure that these were our tanks. After all, ahead passed the reconnaissance. She would warn about the enemy tanks. Shikelchik stepped forward and raised his hand, signaling to the tankers to let the division pass. The lead tank turned on its headlights, illuminated the column, then closed its hatch and roared forward, opening hurricane machine gun fire. It crashed into the column, began to crush the horses and 2 horse control platoon. Other tanks also opened fire. Captain Shikalchik was killed by the first shots. The rest of the soldiers and officers lay down in the ditch. And then the commander of the firing platoon, Lieutenant Petrov, gave a command to the first gun. To battle. The horses of the gun harness were turned across the ditch to the side. The calculation took the howitzer off the front, turned it 180 degrees and fired at point-blank range at the tank approaching the gun. It was not only hit but also rolled into the ditch. The rest of the enemy vehicles did not take the fight and disappeared in the darkness. The division was saved by Lieutenant Petrov and the combat calculation of the first gun of the 5th Battery, and the Chief of Reconnaissance put it under attack. Moving ahead of the column, he did not check the road going into the forest, did not put observers on it. This bitter incident is remembered to me now, about 1 a.m. I returned to the staff car, where there were Regimental Commissar Radchenko, Captain Solomin, a representative of the Field Control Front, Major Kabanov, Dr. Holmenskik, and my new adjutant, Lieutenant Volodya Chitalin, who arrived instead of Brizgalov, appointed battery commander. A small iron stove was stoked in the car. Everyone was peacefully dozing. I sat down comfortably and also dozed off. We were awakened by the indiscriminate firing of machine guns and machine guns. We jumped out of the car and saw that the German machine gunners were coming at us in a deployed formation. Their chains were clearly visible in the cold blue light of flares, which the Nazis launched one after another. The combat installations were in a gully, out of reach of the machine gun fire. The Commissar and I rushed toward them. I shouted to him on the way. As soon as they start the engines, we must rush towards them, crush the German chains and rush to the headquarters of the 14th Cavalry Division. The headquarters of the division was in the village of Vorontsovka, 3 kilometers north of us. Risky, Commander, replied Radchenko. We may run into the main forces, and then it is unclear whether in Vorontsovka now the headquarters. We must withdraw to Verkhnaya Lyubovsha. From there we'll fire a volley. The Commissar's proposal was reasonable and perhaps the only right one. Running up to the fighting vehicles, I ordered the battery commanders to move back 3.5 kilometers towards Verkhnaya Lyubovsha to deploy the installations and fire a salvo at the attackers. While Solomin and I were giving these orders, Radchenko, as we had agreed, ordered the commander of the 1st Unit, Junior Sergeant F.A., Shvetsov, to leave the ravine, deploy the unit, and at the minimum site to fire a salvo. The fire of Shvetsov's fighting vehicle was unexpected for the fascists. He forced them to retreat. However, during the deployment of the unit, machine gun burst killed the driver D. Iosetrov and mortally wounded Junior Sergeant F.A. Shvetsov. Bleeding, he managed to fire 14 shells. When the advanced detachment of the fascists, frightened by our volley, withdrew and the firing subsided somewhat, I ran to the telephone and contacted the headquarters of the 14th Cavalry Division. The commander of the division, Colonel Belogorsky, could not come to the phone. The phone was taken by the Chief of Staff, an old faithful friend, Major Shmilo. I report we were attacked by the Nazis. The road to Rososhnoye is completely open. The enemy's advanced detachment knocked down our guard. The attack has been repulsed, but a new one can't be ruled out. I'm asking for help. I'm sending a squadron immediately, replied Shmilelo. The conversation was interrupted by a rumbling salvo of our battery, which had withdrawn. The shells fell 0.5 kilometer away from us, exactly where the fascists retreated. The commander of the 1st Division, V.M. Solomin, and Adj. M. Solomin and Adjutant V. I. Chitalin was instructed by the forces of the control platoon and the regiment's reconnaissance platoon to organize the defense of the remaining hit vehicles, to establish communication with Major Shmilo and monitor the enemy. I ordered the regiment's Chief of Communications, Senior Lieutenant N.L. Romanov, to urgently extend the communication line from Solomin to the firing position. After that, the Commissar and I drove to the area of firing positions, from where our battery fired a salvo. The installations of the division there were already loaded again and turned towards the enemy. As soon as there was a connection with Solomon, we heard his worried voice. The Germans again went on the offensive. We are covered by vehicles and so far we are holding them back. The hit unit and several vehicles with shells are between us and the fascists. Give us a volley immediately. To fire a volley means to kill our own men. But even such a sacrifice could be in vain. There was no guarantee that we could snatch our shells and machine from the enemy. An attack was required. We quickly gathered all the guardsmen armed with machine guns, put them on the vehicles. Took with them counter-mounted anti-aircraft machine guns mounted on half-trucks. I told Solomon on the phone. Hold on. Let's go to the rescue. A few minutes later, our squad, with extinguished headlights, drove up to the area where the scouts and communicators, led by Solomon and Chitalin, were fighting. For 300 to 400 meters we dismounted and turned in a chain. On the flanks put machine guns and transport vehicles. The idea of the attack was as follows: all vehicles turn on the headlights and move forward, machine guns on the move open fire. The guardsmen go on the attack, short bursts hit the enemy, illuminated by the headlights. If before the dark night was a hindrance to us, now it has become our ally. Suddenly turned on the headlights of more than a dozen vehicles, the hurricane fire of counter-machine guns on the flanks, and a loud hurrah did their job, turned the Nazis in flight. In this battle, Senior Lieutenant N.I. Korolev fought especially bravely. In hand-to-hand combat he killed 5 fascists. With his bravery the lieutenant inspired the guardsmen, drew them into a swift attack. Being wounded in the arm, Korolev remained in the line till the end of the battle. The brave officer was later promoted to the post of the regiment's chief of intelligence. In 1943, already commanding a division, he died a brave death. In this battle we not only beat back our vehicles, but also captured trophies: 4 machine guns, 10 automatic rifles, 5 motorcycles and 20 bicycles. But we were not happy with these trophies. We lost 12 people killed, among them the representative of the field office of the front, Major Kabanov, and a nurse, Elvira Plism. We took the staff cars and shell cars in tow and took them to the area of firing positions. Shetsov's combat rig, who was killed in this battle, was seriously damaged, and it was impossible to tow it. 2 damaged vehicles with shells were left on the battlefield. Scouts and communicators took the defense, and the combat crews went back to the firing positions. Already when the battle subsided, a squadron of 15 men from Major Shmulo arrived to us. Communication with the division headquarters was restored, and I informed Major Shmulo about the night events. He promised to send reinforcements at dawn. The Commissar and I again went to the firing positions. Captain Solomon and Lieutenant Chitalin stayed with a group of scouts at the hit vehicles and the combat unit, which could not be towed away. This place served as an observation post. From here, the road going towards the enemy was clearly visible. It was already beginning to get light when we arrived at the combat vehicles. A few minutes later, I was called to the phone. Solomon. Comrade Commander, I observe a large column of fascists, at least 2 battalions. Goes from Rosochny and descends into the river valley, which is 3 kilometers away. I can't see the head of the column. I ask you to give a volley. The center of the volley, the bridge. Continue observation, I answered Solomon. You will correct the fire. Report to the division commander or Major Shmulo about the column. Firing conditions were unfavorable. The distance was almost extreme. We decided to first fire separate installations to save shells. After checking the initial data, we salvo the first installation. Solomon makes adjustments. We give a second salvo. Solomon transmits. Good! Fire! Third salvo. Reduce the sight by 1 kilometer, Solomon asks. We give a salvo with the installation with reduced sight. I hear Solomon's report. The head of the column came out of the lowlands, quickly approaching us. Reduce the sight. Fire. Solomon's voice is full of excitement. They're coming at us from a wide front. Let's fire. Solomon. I shout into the phone. Switch me to Shmulo. At the other end of the wire, I heard the muffled voice of the Chief of Staff of the division. Not enough shells, I report to him. We have to retreat. I ask you to attack the column in the flank. We'll prepare an attack. Hold on, guardsmen, replied Shmilo. And Solomon kept demanding fire and asking to reduce the sight. Volodya, we're running out of shells. Blow up the installation. Pull back along the communication line and join it as you go. Roger, Comrade Commander. To cover Solomon and give him the opportunity to blow up the fighting vehicle, I gave the command to fire when ready. After that I myself hurried to the second battery, ran behind one installation, and at that time it gave a volley. The jet threw me to the ground like a splinter. Falling down, I instinctively covered my face with the sleeves of my coat. On the ice I was carried away 15 meters. The raised collar of my coat and ear flap protected my face from the fire. All in dust and soot, I got up from the ground. Radchenko ran up to me. "Are your eyes intact?" "Everything is all right," I replied. And Solomon must have died. He told me that they were bypassed. He asked me to fire a volley at him. He reported that the cavalry attack had collapsed. That was the end of the connection. What happened to the cavalry attack? By dawn, Major Shmilo managed to gather about a regiment of cavalrymen. In the deployed combat order squadrons from the gullies jumped out on the plain. Open field from a distance of about 2 kilometers they went on the attack. The Nazis had enough time to prepare for its reflection. Therefore, as soon as our cavalrymen approached the column to the range of machine gun fire, Hitlerites opened hurricane shooting. To continue the attack in a mounted formation was reckless. The squadrons turned back and hid in the gullies. After the unsuccessful attack, the commander of the 14th Cavalry Division decided to withdraw. We, with our division and regimental headquarters, were left alone on the way of the retreating fascists, who were pursued relentlessly by the 1st Guards Rifle Division. We were running out of shells. It was impossible to fire at close ranges. The terrain was flat, and it was impossible to put installations at a slope in the direction of firing. The fascist chains had already entered the dead space, and we could not hit them with our fire. We decided to withdraw to Pavlovka and Krivets. While we were organizing the withdrawal of combat and transport vehicles to the road, the 1st Battery, which had left the firing position, skipped the turn to Krivets and went further through Verkhnaya Lyubovsha to the west, directly to the rear of the fascists. Commissioner of the Special Department, G. Oganezov, was ordered to retrieve the battery at any cost. After Oganezov left, I asked Commissar Radchenko to go to Verkhnaya Lyubovsha, to the bridge, and to ensure the movement of the withdrawing vehicles along the correct route. I myself decided to stay at the firing position until the last vehicle left. Oganezov managed to fulfill the assignment. He returned the battery in time. On the truck, left for me, the driver and I followed the column. When our vehicles at the bridge turned left to Krivets, the fascists came to the hill at the entrance to Verkhnaya Lyubovsha. They opened fire from large-caliber machine guns. Luckily for us, the road to Krivets was in a low-lying area, and only the tops of the cabs were hit by machine gun fire. On the way to Krivets, in Pavlovka, we met Colonel Belogorsky, the commander of the 14th Cavalry Division, and Major Shmilo, the Chief of Staff. Seeing us, Shmilo on horseback quickly flew up to us. "Well, guardsmen, are you alive and well? Have all the vehicles been taken out? Are the losses heavy?" "Sergei Trofimovich, we are alive and well," I answered. "But we lost a lot of wonderful guardsmen. 1 combat unit and 2 vehicles with shells were left on the battlefield." "Very sorry," said Shmilo sympathetically, "but do not lose heart. We'll beat back the vehicles and the combat unit. The Germans are fleeing. They are well pressed by ours from the front. The Corps headquarters is going to Krivets. In Krivets we caught General Kryuchenkin and Colonel Zubanov with their headquarters and reported in detail about all the events of the night and day." "No shells," said the general. "Our rear is cut off by the retreating fascists." In Krivets at this time, in addition to the headquarters of Kryuchenkin and Zubanov, were the 14th Cavalry Division and the 1st Division of our regiment. We had only an inviolable reserve of shells for 1 single volley. After some time, the intelligence reported that in Verkhnaya Lubosha a large number of Hitlerites were concentrated. By all signs there was organised a halt. Radchenko and I went to the nearest farm. From its outskirts, Upper Lyubovsha was well observed. It was indeed packed with Germans. We could see a lot of cars, wagons, smoking kitchens. In all probability, after an accelerated night march, the Nazis managed to break away from our troops pursuing them. The goal, you can't think of a better one. I urgently sent an officer to General Kryuchenkin and Colonel Zubanov with a request to authorize a salvo on Verkhnaya Lyubovskaya, at least one battery. At the same time, he ordered to prepare the division to go to the firing position. Returning from the Corps headquarters, officer reported that General Kryuchenkin and Colonel Zubanov categorically forbade to fire and ordered, having organized observation of the enemy, me and Radchenko to arrive at headquarters. When we arrived at the general, he explained to us. Large enemy forces are coming in 2 columns along the roads on our right and left. We are forced to lurk in the gullies of Krivets to take a circular defence. Our rear is cut off. There is very little ammunition in the units. Zubanov added that now we must put all the installations in the ramps to organise a circular defence of Krivets. To our surprise, the fascists, moving in columns along the roads at a distance of 2 to 4 kilometres from our location, did not send reconnaissance and we were not detected. On the second day, communication with Rusyanov was established, and we became active. We were allowed to give a few volleys of single machines on the retreating columns. The 3rd Division of our regiment, commanded by Captain P.M. Kudiak, was on its way to Krivets through the line where the 1st Division had recently fought heroically. Here, near the fighting vehicle, which never managed to capture the enemy, fell to the death of the brave division commander V. M. Solomon, Ajay. M. Solomon. Adjutant V. I. Chitalin, Battery Commander M. B. Levitt, Anti-Aircraft Battery Commander I.D. Aristov, Anti-Aircraft Machine Gun Commander A.B. Dakulin and others. December 16th, in Krivets we buried the heroes with honours. Over the grave of the fallen guardsmen we swore to take revenge on the fascists. The lives of our comrades cost the enemy dearly, said Commissioner Radchenko. From the volleys of our divisions only near Rosochny the enemy lost hundreds of soldiers and officers, more than 300 vehicles and 200 wagons. We must unite our ranks even more closely. Death to the fascist invaders. A farewell salute is rattling. Guardsmen's hands clutch a mournful handful of frozen earth. On this hard-for-us day, parts of the 1st Guards Rifle Division knocked out the enemy from Rosochny and captured Verkhnaya Lyubovskaya. At 12 o'clock, the rear of the regiment, previously cut off by the enemy, arrived to us in Krivets. We were delivered 8 tons of fuel, food and 770 M13 shells. Our troops, who took part in the defeat of the Yellets grouping of the enemy, went to the line of Nizhnaya Lyubovsha, Livny. For 10 days more than 400 settlements were liberated, including the towns of Yellets and Efremov. The fascists lost here 12,000 killed and wounded. For these 10 days our regiment, supporting the divisions of the Corps, passed with battles in the rear of the German troops more than 200 kilometres. Yellets grouping of the fascists was defeated. General Kostenko's mobile group and other troops of the Northern Wing were given a new task by the commander of the Southwestern Front to reach the Tula-Oral Road 61st, 3rd, 13th Armies and Kostenko's group from the morning of December 18th to go on the general offensive and complete the defeat of the 34th and 35th Hitlerite Army Corps. By the end of December 26th, the main forces to reach the line Plavskern, Novosel, Kolpa and Kostenko's group. In the area of Mtsensk later to reach the line Belev, Ponyry. From December 25th to December 31st, 1941, the 4th and 7th Guards Mortar regiments with volleys of their divisions and batteries provided the advance of the divisions of the 5th Cavalry Corps and the 1st Guards Rifle Division. The divisions had little artillery, and the direct fire support of the infantry and cavalry regiments was provided by the Guards Mortar batteries. Thus, only on December 26th, the 1st Division of our regiment, supporting the Cavalry Division, gave 5 battery salvos on the enemy concentration and its mortar positions in the area of Vysokoye, Trudy Mirievo, Trudki, which were then occupied by our troops. On December 27th, supported by our divisions, the 14th Cavalry Division captured Uсть-Lesky, and on December 31st, the 1st and 3rd Divisions of our regiment fired 15 battery salvos on the enemy's infantry, vehicles and tanks in the area of Berezovets, Kolopovo, Therechka. The last 711 M13 shells were used up. We did not know when and how many shells we would receive. Therefore, on December 31st, M13 divisions from Uсть-Lesky had to be sent to Trudy Mirievo. I myself, with the regimental staff and the M8 Division, commanded by Captain P. I. Valchenko, stayed in Uсть-Lesky. This division had 2 more salvos. In Uсть-Lesky was also the headquarters of the 14th Cavalry Division. On this anxious New Year's Eve night I was summoned to the division headquarters. The Chief of Staff, Major St. Shmulo, informed me that the enemy pulled up a large number of tanks, has superiority in strength, and obviously in the morning will go on the offensive. The front line is not prepared for defence, said Sergei Trofimovich. Anti-tank means, in fact, there are no. Our cavalry regiments against the tanks cannot fight. Between us and the 1st Guards Rifle Division formed a big gap. Rocketeers need to be ready to repel the enemy attack and to withdraw. Returning to my headquarters, I instructed the division commander Captain Valchenko to take up firing positions and keep the division in full combat readiness, and myself to be at the observation post. Having given the necessary orders to the headquarters, I also went to the observation post. At about 2:00 in the morning I was again summoned to the division headquarters. Sergei Trofimovich immediately brought me to the map. Well, dear Alexei Ivanovich, I have a bad New Year's present. In order not to put our division under the enemy's tank attack, it was decided to leave Uсть-Lesky before dawn and break away from the enemy. We leave by ravines and gullies. The road for vehicles is impassable. You have to go back to Trudy Mirievo. Don't waste time, act on your own. Unfortunately, we can't help you. After this far from happy message, I ordered by phone to urgently take all the vehicles to the road and move to Trudy Mirievo. Valchenko's division was given stand down. At dawn, we approached the highway going to Trudy Mirievo. At the head of the column were vehicles of the regiment headquarters, then transport vehicles of the division, followed by combat vehicles, which were covered by the platoon of the division control. At that time, fascist tanks were already approaching the fork of the road. Cutting off our escape route, they opened fire from large-caliber machine guns on the lead vehicles. About 10 more German tanks were moving from the left side of the gully. At the head of our column, a car caught fire. The way of withdrawal was cut off. In front and on the left, enemy tanks, on the right a deep ravine with steep slopes. It was impossible to turn the cars back in the snow. What to do? We could not fire a volley at the attacking enemy, despite the fact that the vehicles were loaded enemy tanks and infantry, were already at a distance of 600 to 700 meters. We, as well as cavalrymen, had no anti-tank means. Our soldiers with automatic rifles and grenades lay down along the road, took up the defence. But what could they do against tanks? Commissioner Radchenko, Chekist Captain Jarnovsky, anxiously asked. What shall we do, Commander? There is only one way out, I answered, to release shells in the direction of the enemy on the minimum aim, the combat vehicles to blow up, and the rest to set fire. Then withdraw through the ravine to Trudy Mirievo. Yes, there is no other way out, confirmed Radchenko. In that case, keep the defence with the guards, do not let the enemy infantry, and I'll run to the fighting vehicles. When I gave the command to fire a volley at minimum aim, and then to blow up the fighting vehicles, we heard alarming shouts, tanks from the rear. The situation was critical. Soldiers and officers lay down around the vehicles. And then not an alarming but a joyful shout was heard. Our tanks. They're ours. And indeed, bypassing the fighting vehicles on the right at full speed, with an open hatch went T-34. On the armour sat 2 tankers and shouted loudly, "Give way. Now we'll show the bastards where the crayfish are." A steel hulk rumbled past me. It was a miracle. All of us were overcome with indescribable joy. Where did our tank come from? Covering the column of cars unnoticed by the enemy, he moved to the left side of the road. The tankers closed the hatch and almost at point-blank range opened cannon fire on the enemy vehicles. From the first shell, the head fascist tank caught fire. Then the second one went up in flames. The rest began to back up, to hide in the ravines, to go into the forest. Our tank climbed the hill, and from there hit 2 more German cars. The road to Trudy-Merievo was free. The tank, our saviour, stopped at the crossroads, like a mighty guardian, turning its formidable cannon towards the enemy. Under its cover the guards removed the burning vehicles from the way and moved on Trudy-Merievo. The commissar and I heartily thanked the tankers. "It's not us you should thank," the crew commander replied, smiling, "but the hostess, at whose house we spent the night. We are from the 129th Tank Brigade. It was supporting the 1st Guards Rifle Division. Last night, when we were on our way to the division's section, the undercarriage malfunctioned. We had to turn to Uсть-Leski. We repaired the tank and went to rest. In the night we were woken up by our hostess guys. Our men are leaving. Katyusha and Indeed already left the village. We started our tank and followed you." Yes, the tankers helped us a lot. After moving away 3 kilometers, we fired a volley into the forest, where the Nazis had withdrawn. So thanks to the appeared tank, we managed to get out of a seemingly hopeless situation. We lost 3 men killed, 5 were wounded. After the volley, we moved again to Trudy-Merievo. There was the headquarters of General Krychenkin's cavalry corps. We reported to the general about everything that had happened, about the heroic actions of the T-34 tank. Having listened to our report, Krychenkin said, "Well, dear guardsmen, it is time for us to part again. It is ordered to send your units to Voronezh. It's a pity, but what can you do? Thank you for your combat work. I wish you further success, and we will not forget about the tankers, your saviours. We will present them to the award." The new year of 1942 came, and with it new battles, new trials.